The Roaring Twenties, the Ballyhoo Years. In the summer of 1925, the eyes of the nation turned to the small town of Dayton, Tennessee. The subject of the nation's attention came to be known as the Scopes Monkey Trial. John T. Scopes, a substitute science teacher at the local high school, had in theory broken a law called the Butler Law of Tennessee, which outlawed the teaching of evolution. Now, Scopes wasn't quite sure whether he had broken the law or not, but he used a textbook that did describe evolution. The town fathers of Dayton thought that this presented an opportunity to bring attention to their little town, and so they moved forward in the prosecution of their own son, John T. Scopes, and this became a nationwide sensation. It did indeed draw great attention to Dayton, Tennessee, and some of the most prominent minds and speakers and thinkers in the country were drawn to this trial, which seemed to pit the voices of modernity and science and intelligence and knowledge against the voices of religion and tradition and small-town life and these sorts of things. Drawn to the trial were William Jennings Bryan, on the side of the prosecution, opposed to evolution. Bryan, along with being a prominent politician of the era, was also a literalist in his stance on the Bible. On the other side, Clarence Darrow, perhaps the most well-known attorney in the country, a vicious debater, an incredibly sharp and quick-witted mind. Clarence Darrow represented the defense and Scopes himself. In the culminating moment of the trial, William Jennings Bryan actually took the witness stand as an expert witness on the Bible, and Clarence Darrow, with rapier wit, went at William Jennings Bryan in what became an incredibly famous cross-examination. Darrow asked Bryan questions like, was Jonah really swallowed by a whale? Did God really make the earth stand still? And a host of other questions that challenged the literal interpretation of the Bible. At the end of the trial, Scopes was found guilty. He had, in fact, broken the Butler Law, or admitted to breaking the law anyway. That was never really much in question. And he was fined $100. The defense's hopes for an appeal were eventually dashed, and the trial was thrown out. And so this trial in Dayton, Tennessee, really highlighted the clash at that time. Historians for decades looked back on this as a sweeping victory for Darrow, for the forces of science and knowledge and modernity, and a crushing and humiliating defeat for William Jennings Bryan and indeed the supporters of religion. More recent studies, though, have indicated that the outcome was not as clear as many historians had come to assume, that the nation was much more evenly split between the two sides. In fact, many Americans disliked intensely Clarence Darrow, who came to have the reputation of being utterly ruthless and vicious in his questioning of William Jennings Bryan. And Bryan, known as the commoner and sort of a favorite son of many across the countryside, died just a few weeks after this trial, and many people believed it was Darrow and his harsh questioning that was the final dagger in the heart of William Jennings Bryan. The Scopes trial, situated conveniently right in the middle of the decade of the 1920s, and in some ways right in the middle of the country, comes to represent a turning point moment, represent many of the clashes that were ongoing in the country during this decade of the 1920s. It was an age when science and knowledge and invention and technology were making great strides. We had seemingly reached a point when science could answer all of our questions. At the same time, supporters of religion and the Bible and tradition clung to their beliefs, and again the nation was split just about 50-50. This was also a moment when the clash between the big city and the countryside was reaching a head as well, and there were elements of this evident in the trial. Even issues of gender and changing roles, particularly for women in the country, were brought to light in the trial, as in some ways the woman pictured here represents. While she's not quite in full-blown flapper gear, she does seem to represent the more progressive and forward-looking mind of women in that era. They can't make a monkey out of me, says the sign, ironically enough, around her neck. So these are some of the issues that we will be discussing as we discuss the decade that has come to be known as the Roaring Twenties. One of the reasons we have come to consider the 20s a roaring decade is because of the booming economy. The 1920s are one of those decades that we look back on as an era of great prosperity. We think of the 1950s as another decade like this, the 1990s, and others in our history. But the 20s were certainly a time of economic prosperity. There are a number of reasons for this, one of which was the end of World War I. Now, what frequently happens at the end of a major war like this is actually a depression setting in. The nation has to adjust to a peacetime economy, and all of the productivity and wartime production as it is going away can lead to economic difficulties and unemployment and spasms in the economy. And there certainly was some of that in the wake of World War I. 1919, for instance, was a very difficult year in terms of the economy. There were many labor clashes that year as millions of the veterans of World War I returned home and often struggled at first to find jobs as the workplace, again, shifted to a peacetime economy. But even by the early 1920s, certainly by the mid-1920s, those kind of rough patches in the economy were well behind us. And for the most part, the 1920s were a decade of great prosperity. Well, why is that? Well, part of it is because during World War I, the United States, the home front, essentially remained untouched by the war. It was the nations of Europe that were ravaged by the war. And certainly a nation like France struggled mightily to regain its economic footing after the war. The United States, on the other hand, had really suffered no damage on the home front. And in fact, while much of the rest of the world was undergoing great hardship and physical damage, the United States was ramping up its productivity, and factories were churning out products at peak efficiency. And all of those wartime goods taught American businessmen and producers many lessons about how to produce high-quality products very rapidly and very efficiently. Which leads us to the next point regarding mass production. The war inspired factory owners and industrialists and producers to rethink their methods of production. How can we produce these vital weapons and products of the war more rapidly and efficiently? And so one of the answers to that was mass production. Interchangeable parts, the production line, the conveyor belt, taking whatever the product was down the line, and one worker at each stop adding a part to it or performing one simple task over and over and over again. And so we take these lessons with us into the peacetime economy in the aftermath of the war. The best example of this is the Ford Motor Company, which I'll be talking about shortly, heading the charge into this age of mass production. But many, many other companies as well took the lessons learned during the war years and transformed them into the making of all kinds of other products And again, we'll mention some of these things more in just a few moments, but we think of the 1920s largely as an age of new appliances and electric products and gadgets and gizmos being produced. Actually, you see in the picture there at the bottom a few examples in terms of things like refrigerators and kitchen appliances. There are many, many other things. Well, methods of mass production and the production line greatly increased efficiency in making all of these kinds of products. Related to this was a still growing sense of expertise and professionalism in industry. We saw some of this even in the progressive era, back in the 1880s and 90s. Companies beginning to invest in research and development and planning and studies in efficiency and thinking about the layout in a factory and how that impacted the way things were produced. Well, by the 1920s, this was becoming in and of itself a realm of expertise and efficiency. There were a growing number of business experts and consultants whose job it was and whose expertise it was to understand how to produce things more efficiently. It was said in the 1920s, as far as business, nothing happens by accident anymore. The best example of the prosperity of the 1920s is the automobile industry. It is literally and figuratively the driving force behind the economy in the 1920s, much as we discuss the railroads driving the economy in the decades following the Civil War. When we think about the automobile, it isn't simply the car itself or the automobile itself that moves forward when the automobile industry is booming. Consider all of the different elements that go into your car and the driving of your car. And so the rubber industry is booming to make the tires. The metal industry is booming to make the frame and all the different parts. The oil and gasoline industry is booming. Glass to make the windows on the cars. Road construction itself becomes a huge industry in the 1920s. Roadside attractions and restaurants. You think now when we drive along the interstate, at every exit, there are signs indicating what is available for you in terms of restaurants, what is available in terms of lodging or hotels, what is there in terms of gasoline stations and different other kinds of attractions. Now, clearly, in the 1920s, all of those industries are coming along, but as the automobile is becoming more and more an essential part of life, all of these other industries are raised along the way as well. Street signs, stoplights, everything you can imagine. As many as 4 million Americans by the end of the 20s were employed in these various industries. It's absolutely the center of American life. By the end of the 1920s, there were about 23 million cars on the roads, and we can estimate that about half of American families owned a car, at least one car, at that point. The automobile was rapidly becoming the center of American life, and it's difficult to overstate what a huge impact it had on American life. Just imagine what life would be like today without a car. Probably many of you already own your own cars, and certainly members in your family own cars. How would we get around? How would we get the things that we need to do? The automobile now means that more and more Americans are driving to work rather than walking to work or commuting to work. More and more Americans are beginning to engage in travel, weekend activities, summer vacations. All of these industries are coming along. We think about something as simple as dating. How would you date or court someone prior to the automobile? We'll talk about some of that a little bit later, but it certainly made things a lot easier for people to have their own cars. Entire cities spring up in support of this industry, and we think of Detroit, Michigan in particular, which even today remains the motor city, the basketball team called the Pistons, and so on. It was a noteworthy city prior to the automobile in 1900, about 285,000 people, which was certainly a large city at that time. But by 1930, its population had multiplied 5 times over to about 1.5 million. Henry Ford certainly dominates this industry, and it is Henry Ford and his reliance and insistence upon the production line that really transformed this industry. Perhaps the best example of these changes is the factory or plant known as the River Rouge plant in Dearborn, Michigan. You see a picture, a painting of it there on the right-hand side of the screen. And Henry Ford's vision for this plant was, for the first time, to have every part of the production process completed in the same facility, in the same factory. Prior to this, various parts and components were built in different factories and had to be shipped to a place where the final automobile was put together. Henry Ford thought we can improve efficiency, we can lower cost, we can speed up the process if everything is made here. There were about 75,000 workers employed in this plant. It had its own steel mill, it had its own power plant, it had a rail line leading into it. Perhaps you can see that in the picture. And it was located on the water so that other things could be shipped in from the water. Again, this is all about efficiency and greater productivity. But certainly the Ford Motor Company was not the only one. There was room for competition. General Motors was the staunchest competitor of the Ford Motor Company. If Henry Ford made cars for the common man, and you see pictures of those Ford automobiles down there at the bottom. They were relatively affordable for that time. Ford's vision was that his own workers should be able to afford to purchase the cars that they were making. And he also at one point made the famous line that you can have it in any color you like as long as it's black. All of the early Ford motor cars were black. Well, General Motors appealed to a more elite element of society and offered much greater variety, different colors, and on the whole fancier models, including the Cadillac. And there were a number of other competitors in the automobile industry as well. But certainly it is at the very core of the economic prosperity of the 1920s.